We're coming to you live tonight from John Carroll University as part of our Centered on Excellence webinar series. And it's our great honor tonight to bring you former NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams, who's here with us on the campus.
Glad to be here, Dan.
Carroll. Thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
You are here in large part because of your great friend, the late Tim Russert, who was an alum here, class of 1972, and left such an incredible mark on our industry as the moderator of Meet the Press. Start this off by telling us a little bit about your friendship with Tim and how that brought you here to John Carroll.
Well, I actually first got to know Tim when I was the Pentagon spokesman in the first Bush administration. And I used to get a lot of calls from bureau chiefs. And Tim was at the time the bureau chief of NBC News, in addition to being the moderator of Meet the Press. Other bureau chiefs would call with sort of logistical questions. Can we get Sam Donaldson on an aircraft carrier? Can Dan Rather ride in a jet? But Tim was the only one who actually called with what I would call substantive journalistic editorial questions. And I really respected him for that. And when my time at the Pentagon was about to expire, when it was pretty clear that George Bush was not going to get reelected, he said, come and talk to me about a job at NBC. So I did. I came there as what is called a national correspondent, which basically means that you really have no beat and you can be assigned anything. But pretty quickly, Carl Stern, who was, in fact, an anchor in Cleveland for many years at the NBC affiliate here, and practically invented covering the Supreme Court for television, he was about to leave NBC and become the spokesman for Janet Reno, who was the first attorney general for President Clinton. And so that left an opening. And Tim came to me and said, would you like to cover the Supreme Court and the Justice Department? And I said, yes, immediately. Now, my guess, Dan, is that the reason he asked me is that nobody else wanted to do it. I think at the time, covering the Supreme Court was considered to have a very high homework to being on the air ratio. And it was considered a sort of a dry backwater. But I just thought it was fascinating. I love legal issues. I covered the courts when I was a local reporter, which I was for 11 years before I came to NBC and before I worked at the Pentagon. So, and the Justice Department, we were off to the races, and it turned out to be, a great beat. And I am so glad I did it. But you're right. I mean, Tim, I have many reasons to respect him. He hired me, of course, for which I'm very grateful. But the fact is that he set an example, and he had a legacy of excellence that, is really incomparable. And I'm here because of my loyalty to Tim.
They have so many great tributes to Tim here in the halls at John Carroll University, part of the Meet the Press set, as we're showing you here. It was great to walk around campus today and to see that. He left such a high bar for all of us in this industry, holding public officials accountable, reporting with fairness and accuracy. And you lived up to those same ideals for so many years covering the Justice Department.
I can't say whether that's true or not, but it's certainly true for Tim. And I think one of Tim's advantages is that, remember, he had worked in government. He worked for Mario Cuomo, the governor of New York. He worked for Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the U.S. senator from New York. So he had considerable political experience before he came into NBC, before he came into broadcasting. He's a lawyer. He trained to be a lawyer. He obviously studied politics here at John Carroll University. He was a sort of a rabble-rousing student at the time, very involved in student politics. He was sort of just a political animal from the get-go, and I think that helped in his reporting, having worked sort of, if you will, both sides of the street.
Well, and you worked for Republican office holders in the Department of Defense. He worked for Democratic office holders. You couldn't tell that on the air. The two of you both presented information and news and political news on the air with a down the middle approach, which we'll talk about throughout this hour, because it's hard to be exactly down the middle sometimes these days, because there are facts flying different directions and people trying to throw you off. But neither you or Tim showed any of your prior background in politics while you were on the air covering politics.
Well, I know that was true of Tim. I think My own experience in government, it sort of cuts both ways. On the one hand, having worked in the government, I think anybody who did that, and Tim or, Diane Sawyer or George Stephanopoulos,
sure,
or anybody who's had experience in government before they come into television news, certainly, I think there's a little bit of sympathy for people in the government, and not such a willingness to jump to somebody lied to me. Government people are often trying to do the right thing. And so I think there's a little bit of patience, if you will. On the other hand, there's also a sense that having worked in the government, you think, well, now, wait a minute. I know they can do better. If I get stiffed by a spokesman somewhere, I'd say, look, I've been there. I know you can do better. Now, come on and give me a better answer. So I think it works both ways. You're perhaps more patient on one hand and less willing to put up with nonsense on the other.
We're not only here, you and I, at John Carroll as part of this conversation, we also have people from chapters, regional Emmy chapters all across the country watching this tonight, and also some participants from two of our other regional chapters, Amy Lang from our Michigan chapter and Shatar Collier joining us as well from our Pacific Southwest chapter. Our thanks to both
Nobody
of you
from
for
Guam
being with us as well. Nobody from Guam tonight, but maybe in our next webinar.
Okay, all right.
Amy, you obviously also cover the courts and issues that come before the court, and we've all admired Pete's work doing so through the years. What are some of your observations about his time, about where we are as an industry, and some of your thoughts and questions for Pete about his great career in TV?
Well, I'm certainly curious to know about the sort of evolution of covering the courts. I mean, we're talking about the Supreme Court here, not, your district court or what have you. And certainly there are challenges, I think, at every level to covering courts. But certainly the Supreme Court is a whole different animal. Federal courts in general are a different animal. We don't have cameras in those courts. So that presents a little bit of a challenge for covering them. And I'm just curious because, it's such a major operation. I have actually covered the Supreme Court and found it absolutely fascinating. So I can see why, Mr. Williams, you jumped on that opportunity. But how has it changed over the course of your career? And what do you see being sort of the challenges for this next generation of reporters out there on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, I think it has changed, and the way we cover it has changed for two entirely different reasons. It has changed in this sense. We now have the most political Supreme Court that we've had in decades, certainly the most conservative Supreme Court in more than 50 years. For the first time after the last Trump appointee was confirmed, all the conservatives on the court were appointed by Republican presidents. All the liberals on the court, using these terms loosely, were appointed by Democratic presidents. That was not always the case.
You always had somebody flip.
Well,
yeah,
Sandra Day O'Connor, who
Sure.
was oftentimes the so-called swing vote, was appointed by Ronald Reagan. After she retired, Anthony Kennedy took over the role as the swing vote. He was also appointed by Reagan. John Paul Stevens, who ended up joining with the liberals, was appointed by President Ford. So now we have it all lined up, all very political. So the court itself has changed, I think, in that way. Obviously, courts go through these sort of swings where sometimes you have a very liberal court and sometimes you have a very swing court. And in a way, I think one way to look at it is we went through a very liberal period in the 50s and 60s with the Earl Warren Court. And then we had a kind of a moderate states' rightsy kind of court under William Rehnquist. And now under John Roberts, we have a much more conservative court. So the court itself has changed. How the court is covered has also changed. Because when I started covering the Supreme Court more than 29 years ago, the only way to read the briefs and the other thing I would say about the Supreme Court, just to say the obvious thing here, Dan, is you've been through this. The Supreme Court is not a source beat. The Justice Department and the FBI, those are source beats. People who thrive on those beats need to have sources in the Justice Department or the FBI or ATF or wherever who will tell us stuff that isn't public so we can, report it.
And you did that beat as well, the Justice Department.
Yeah, and that is a source beat, right. And you live and die based on your sources. Not true at the Supreme Court. the Supreme Court is, everybody's on equal footing. We can all see the cases percolate out there in the lower courts. We can say, this is an issue probably headed for the Supreme Court. Read the district court opinion, read the Court of Appeals opinion, watch it get there. When the briefs are filed, read the briefs, watch the oral argument, get the decision. It's all out there. So, the art, if there is, as it were, for us, the Supreme Court, is how you choose which stories you're going to cover, how you explain them, how you try to make them come alive. So, that's one difference. But the way the reporting has changed of the Supreme Court is, as I started to say, in the old days, when I started covering the court, if you wanted to read the briefs, you had to go to the court. That's where they were. Now they're all online. First, they were on the SCOTUS blog, the Supreme Court website. Mm-hmm. Now they're on the Supreme Court's website. Every single brief in every single case is on the web. The oral argument now is live on the web. This is a result of COVID. They started doing that because the public couldn't get into the courtroom. Then when the courtroom opened back up again, they decided to keep doing it. Didn't used to be the case. So you can pretty much cover the Supreme Court in your jammies from home if you want. And that's one way that covering the court has changed. But of course, the other big difference is it used to be, if you were a reporter for the New York Times, you spent all day thinking about the decision and calling people up before you filed your story at 5:30 at night. Now, everybody has to file quickly on the web. Every newspaper reporter is now just like a wire service reporter or a network reporter. We were expected to blurt out on television as soon as the decision comes out. It used to be we're the only people that did that, or the wires. Now everybody has to do it. So covering the court just journalistically has changed a lot as well.
What's your advice for people in local news who do cover a lot of state Supreme Court rulings? We've had many in recent years that are of great importance in the state of Indiana. That information comes to you with the entire briefing.
Yeah.
You have to read through it quickly and determine what is the essence of this ruling. You did that so well, whether it was on NBC, sometimes you were on cable, live on MSNBC, needing to get to the root of a decision and figuring out what it means, what the impact of that is. That's hard to do because you want to get it on the air as soon as you can, but you need to make sure that you're right.
It is. It's helpful. It's helpful to get it right. Yes. That occurred to me during the Bush v. Gore decision in 2000, when I'm standing out there in front of the Supreme Court in the freezing cold, thinking this is not a good time to screw this up. Look, if you're going to cover the Indy 500 in your community, I don't think you would assign someone who's never seen a race car. There's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that you need to know about automobile racing and the people who are involved and the racers themselves and their families and the pit crews and the legacy and the risks and the dangers and the history, if you're going to cover the Indy 500 in any kind of responsible way. You don't send the food editor to cover the Super Bowl. So one of the things I'm very grateful about for NBC, and I think it's true of my colleagues at the other networks and certainly at the newspapers, is that they give us time to cover the court. So, it takes a lot of time. You need time to read the briefs. I feel very sorry for people who get sort of thrown in to cover a legal story with no background. Look, I'm not a lawyer. Of the people who cover the Supreme Court, of all the reporters regularly, only about a third of us were lawyers. Most of us were not. I don't think that was a hindrance. I don't think being a lawyer is also a hindrance. I think you can do it either way.
Sure.
Robert Barnes, who is a very gifted reporter at the Washington Post, is not a lawyer. Adam Liptak, who covers it for the New York Times, is a lawyer and was, in fact, one of the New York Times' lawyers before he took over the beat. So you need to, you cannot cover a decision from, just walk in and read the decision and have any kind of clue what it says. So you have to have some experience in reading court decisions. You have to be familiar with the case. But the fortunate thing is that, especially in the courts of appeal, you get many bites at the apple. As the briefs come in, you understand the arguments. You go to the oral argument. If you're covering a trial, you're there every day. You hear the witnesses. You know what the jury is hearing. So you have to invest the time in it, though. That's the important thing. And I will say one other thing, Dan, and pardon me for giving you these long answers.
Yeah, no problem.
But I can't help myself.
That's why
I'm sitting here with you. I feel like I'm on in focus.
Exactly. Thank you for the plug.
You're welcome. Every Sunday at
9:30.
All right. Look, I'm going to say something that may be somewhat controversial. I don't think it's controversial. It may not be something that a lot of news general managers or editors want to hear, but look, I think journalists who cover the courts now have an additional responsibility because there's no more civic education in the schools. I don't think most people have a clue what the courts do or why judges rule the way they do.
So we have a role to educate.
I think so, with every single
additional
story.
context that
Absolutely.
that we maybe haven't
so
provided.
It's not enough just to say the court ruled abortion is illegal in Ohio. You have to say what the courts, what's the reasoning of it? I think that's an essential part of any story about court decisions. You have to you can't just say what the bottom line is. You have to say why the court said what it said. What was their legal reasoning? You're not only educating your viewers, but that's just part of the story.
The Dobbs ruling, obviously, which took place right before you retired.
Yeah, this was the ruling striking down Roe v. Wade.
Striking down Roe v. Wade. Obviously, that remains sort of the top of mind court case here in recent years that has changed the political landscape of this country. You talk about adding context into stories and what it means. We, as part of this, we were looking at some of the reporting the New York Times did on the court's decision on Dobbs and how 62% of Americans did not think Roe v. Wade should be overturned. As you mentioned, this is a court taking a different direction. What do you think about context of that nature? How does that inform journalists, particularly on a topic that's very sensitive? People have very different feelings about it. And obviously, the court isn't ruling based on public polling, but the fact that public polling exists that
you could say just the contrary.
This ruling, wasn't popular. How important is context like that, do you feel?
Well, very, but think about the context of the Dobbs decision. This was an appeal from a Mississippi law that was clearly passed in order to challenge Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade, Casey versus Planned Parenthood, and some follow-on cases basically stood for the proposition that states can restrict abortion up to the point of viability, but they can't ban it before then. After viability, they can ban it because then the equities tilt more toward the state and less toward the individual. That was the logic of the Supreme Court's decisions in the past. So what Mississippi did is said, well, we're going to ban abortion after 15 weeks. Well, viability is what, 26, 27 weeks, something like that. So that would cut the time in half, basically, to get an abortion. What Mississippi said to the Supreme Court when it asked them to take the case is, all we want you to do is rule on whether a state can ban abortion before viability. You don't have to overturn Roe v. Wade. That is not before the court, Mississippi said. The case sat there for 18 months before the Supreme Court decided whether to take it. Remember, Ruth Bader Ginsburg died during that period, waiting for Amy Coney Barrett to come on board. And then when the court granted the case and the next round of briefing happened, Mississippi said, and while you're at it, let's overturn Roe v. Wade.
Yeah.
The mere fact that the Supreme Court took the case told you everything you needed to know about how it was going to come out.
You felt that was to be the likely outcome, even before
because it was the Mississippi law under existing Supreme Court precedent was clearly unconstitutional. It was not a hard question. If those past decisions said you can't ban abortion before viability and a state bans abortion before viability, it's not rocket science to say that is against the Supreme Court precedent, and if they stick to their guns, would be unconstitutional. So that was tip-off number one, and a very big one. Tip-off number two was when the Supreme Court upheld that Texas law that allowed anybody to file a lawsuit against anybody that assisted in an abortion. They didn't do anything to stop that. That was tip-off number three. And then there was the oral argument itself, which I think, resolved any lingering doubt about whether there was, the Chief Justice was clearly pushing at oral argument this middle ground of saying, all right, let's say that a state can can block abortion after 15 weeks, but let's not overturn Roe. That went nowhere during oral argument. So again, it was pretty clear what was going to happen.
I want to turn to Shatar Collier as well from our Pacific Southwest chapter. Oh, we just lost her briefly. So I'm going to head back to Amy there.
She's just exhausted from my last answer. At least she needed to lie down.
Amy, obviously, this is a story that is covered in every state as laws continue to change. What are some of your other observations on Pete's career and the way he's covered all of this and how it impacts our industry?
Well, I think that one of the wonderful aspects of your reporting is that it is so down the middle. Here are the facts. I don't think that we ever felt like you were passing judgment in any way. And I think that that is, very laudable. And I think it's important because we are in this sort of very strange time where so much is opinion. So many facts are disputed when they are indeed facts. And so I think we are in a very troubling time as journalists and just as a society. And so I do wonder, how you felt that you were able to be so direct and so, I guess, without an opinion, although I'm sure that you had one.
Well, in a way, thank you for that very kind comment. I would say that I was very lucky in the sense that covering the courts, even-handedness is sort of built into the system. Cases that come to the Supreme Court typically are there because they're hard, and they've divided the lower courts, with the exception of cases like Roe v. Wade, which didn't divide the lower courts. But for the most part, cases come to the Supreme Court because they raise difficult questions. And what I would find is that I'd read the first side, the side saying, please take this case. The lower courts got it wrong. And I'd read the briefs and I'd say, wow, that's a pretty good argument. Then I'd read the briefs on the other side and say, wow, that's also a pretty good argument. I understand why this case is here. So, I think you're right. I think the test for any reporter is, can you tell how whether the reporter has a thumb on one side of the scale and hopes the thing comes out a certain way? Was certainly my goal to avoid that. And we did all the careful things that one does. For example, we never used any of the incendiary language. We never would say pro-life or pro-choice or any of those loaded terms. I see this a lot in some of the reporting on the question of banning this so-called abortion pill, mifepristone, which is now, potentially before the Supreme Court because of the restrictions imposed by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which are now on hold, that would restrict when you can get it and how you can get it and so forth. And, it's a big deal because more than half of abortions now are performed by this process. And a lot of critics call it chemical abortion instead of medication abortion. So again, we tried to shy away from those loaded terms. But I guess I'm lucky because, the covering the courts, it's the even-handedness, as I say, is sort of built into the system.
Mm-hmm. I think we have Shatar Safira Collier now in our Pacific Southwest chapter. We lost you earlier. Shatar, some questions for Pete?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for all of your amazing journalistic contributions. And we previously had a panel on mental health and assisting the journalists in all of the stories that they cover. So for you, with a career that is as long as it is and all of the topics that you've had to cover, how do you deal with the excitement, the disappointment, the surprise, and other actual techniques that journalists can use for young reporters who are just starting so that they too can have long careers?
So the excitement is what makes it fun. Reporters to some extent are adrenaline junkies. While I got a lot of satisfaction out of, doing a Supreme Court story that I thought was even-handed and answered all the questions. I mean, we got a minute 40 if we were lucky. And you had to say, what was the controversy that brought the court to the case? What were the arguments on both sides? What did the court rule and what are the implications? And, jam that all into a minute 40. And on those days when I thought I did that well, I thought, well, this is a pretty satisfying job. But let's face it, breaking stories is also exciting for reporters. And we love that and live on that high.
That's hard to come down from sometimes too, that adrenaline.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. I will say what was certainly difficult for me, because of the nature of my beat, I also covered a lot of really awful things. Mm-hmm. The Oklahoma City bombing, the sniper attacks in Washington, the anthrax mail attacks, the Boston Marathon bombing. That one took a lot out of me, frankly. Not so much covering the investigation, which was, a lot of working your sources to try to move the story along, but covering the trial and sitting there day after day as people came in. 3 people were killed, but hundreds and hundreds were injured in ways that are permanent and constantly painful. These bombs were built in such a horrific way that they were built with nails and screws and intended to just cause as much carnage as possible. And they were these people coming into the courtroom to talk about the metal that's still in them and moving around, and it was just really difficult. Frankly, I reached a point where I thought, sitting at my desk, if one more time the desk called and said, there's been a school shooting, you have to get out here, I just thought, I don't know that I can do this again. That was what was especially difficult for me. And I think, I know people who have been photographers who have to go to war zones and see the kind of inhumanity that man can inflict on his fellow man. And it can take a toll. So yeah, I think especially for people who cover combat or are exposed to those sorts of awful things.
Even those who have to cover at the local level,
yes.
Crime, school shootings. We've all seen that in every region
absolutely.
of the
It's tough.
Yeah.
It is
Those are
really
hard.
tough. Yes.
Those
And
are so
so I
hard to
think
see.
you're right. I mean, there certainly is a role for, and I worked for a big company and they had the resources to offer a mental health or, counseling for people who wanted it. Not everybody has that good fortune, but you're right. I mean, it is very important because of some of the awful things that we have to cover.
It's so important to take advantage of those resources and opportunities, no doubt. Shatar, great question there. We appreciate it. We do want to remind everyone that we have some questions from viewers, and you have the ability to ask a question of Pete right now on our Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter/X pages. They call it X now for exactly. One question in our comments: what was the best and worst part about covering major news events in Washington, D.C.?
The best part of it is that you sort of felt like you were covering something that was important. Covering the Bush v. Gore election in 2000 was just the relatively unimportant issue of who was going to be the president next.
It's a minor thing to settle.
So that's a fun story to be in the middle of. I think people who cover, I'm sure all the reporters who covered the historic vote today in the House to oust the House Speaker,
what a day it's been.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you're a political reporter, you cover Congress, whatever you think of whether that's a good thing for the country or not, it is a heck of a story. So, it's exciting to be in the middle of that kind of thing happening. The other advantage of covering stories in Washington, I think, for the most part, is that it's almost impossible to think of a story that someone won't talk to you about. I mean, after all, Congress is 535 people who want to be reelected and be on television. So, it's not hard to find people to interview. Right. But, even if you're covering the CIA or the National Security Administration or something like that, I mean, the town is full of former people who used to work for the intelligence agencies. There are think tanks. I mean, it's pretty easy to find somebody who can help you with a story. There are lots of interest groups in Washington. I mean, just about any issue that you can think of, from, climate change to, I don't know, to gender equality or whatever, somebody has a group in Washington that, you can reach out to. So those are the plus sides. The downside is, sometimes you get into these ruts of running stories, and you come to work the next day and you think, oh man, do I have to do that again? Yeah. So that's sort of the downside to it. But all in all, I think most Washington reporters, I will say this one thing though. I mean, it always occurs to me when there's a big Washington story, Washington will convulse itself with the House Speaker vote. It's a big deal. It's historic. how do people in Indianapolis really feel about the
How
fact?
does it affect the average?
Yeah,
viewer?
and it
Right.
probably not much. And so maybe Washington stories do get to be kind of overdone sometimes.
So that's leading to my next topic here about journalism, where we are right now in journalism, because we hear a lot about how when it comes to politics, we cover too often either the shiny object or the horse race
Mhm.
or the vote today to oust the speaker, which is historic and needs to be covered. So do the impeachment hearings and inquiries. And we've had so many cataclysmic things here in recent years in politics, but there is also this need, as you just alluded to focus on things of real substance that matter to real people in their lives and in their homes. How do you balance that?
Well, look, it's not a new problem. I think it's one of journalism's everlasting problems. Conflict is interesting. And you're right, there's always a tendency to focus on the ping pong match. It's always more interesting to write a story about who's duking who over the head about whether Obamacare should be repealed or not, rather than the specifics of how the Affordable Care Act works. That's considered sort of nerdy policy stuff. But look, that's the more important thing. This sort of day-to-day, who's ahead, who's behind, I think we way overplay the polls, and especially presidential campaigns, because there's really only one that matters. And this endless reporting about polls, I find such a distraction. I would rather know why there's such, why are people in the country so upset that they are looking for alternatives to people that are running Washington? We have almost historically low unemployment. We have almost historically high GDP. What is it that has so divided Americans? That story doesn't get covered much. If as much attention were given to that as was given to who's ahead or behind in the latest Quinnipiac poll, I think we'd be better off.
How do we do that in television, do you think? Because the story also needs to be engaging with the viewers and interesting enough, not only to be able to sell it to the viewers, but also to your producers. When you say, here's a story I want to do today, it's on an important topic in this local school board. So it needs to be engaging, but obviously to focus on something important, you've got to be able to make the case for that story, even within your own newsroom sometimes.
Well, I think the answer is kitchen tables.
That's right.
How
does it affect the family there in Indianapolis?
I always thought there was a federal
Detroit,
law that said every network television story had to open with someone sitting at their kitchen table,
right,
looking at their A, Social Security payments, B, bills, C, utility things. But that's the answer, is you personalize it. Rather than doing a story in abstract about the Affordable Care Act, you find a guy in West Virginia who would die without the liver transplant that he got paid for by Obamacare. I mean, the same with the thing I was just talking about, with the disenchantment of Washington. We're all fascinated by ourselves. So, go find viewers who feel this way, individuals, profile a guy who's running a glass repair shop who thinks that Washington is just too much in his business. Those are, I think, interesting stories that people would identify with.
Amy, I want to send it back to you. Additional comments there from, or questions there from Michigan?
Well, I certainly think that, when you're looking at something from, say, a local perspective versus a national perspective, that holds true, personalize something, no matter what. I wonder at the level, Pete, that you were working at, I would imagine you have a lot more producers and a lot more assistants in doing some of that, because I know some of the reporters in smaller markets are often saddled with a lot of responsibility these days in terms of a lot of that MMJ, that multimedia journalism. So shooting their own stuff and then editing their own stuff and going ahead and getting a story on the web and making sure that their social media is up to date. So I know that I think that we're asking a lot of our new and younger journalists.
Yes, that's true. I mean, it's sort of back to the future. When I was a local reporter back in the days of, if you'll pardon the expression, film, if I went out to interview somebody, I had to set the camera up myself, frame the shot, sit down, do the interview.
And you helped us set up the lighting here in this for this webcast.
I will certainly deny that. Um,
No
you
union
know,
violation.
I had to
Right.
set the camera up, frame the shot, sit down, do the interview, get up, turn the camera off, ask somebody my height to stand there so I could frame the stand up.
Exactly.
So you know, I hope we don't go back to that too much, because that you do spend a lot of time doing that. You know, I will say this. Look, there was two people that covered the Supreme Court, me and my producer, Mike Cosner. That was it. We didn't have a lot of, you know, we did it ourselves. We were a small, mighty unit. And, you know, when it came time to do a story, I would say, Mike, here are the people we need to interview. See if you can set the interviews up. And then it was his job to, you know, book the crews and all that kind of stuff, or get them to sit down in front of a Zoom or whatever we do now. But we, you know, we didn't really have a lot of people. I don't know, maybe it's because of my local experience. I liked doing things myself. And I mean, look, that's the Supreme Court kind of stuff where you know something is coming down the pike. You know 4 weeks ahead of time when a Supreme Court argument is going to be. So you have time to work on the story. Now, there were certainly days when, you know, I'm sitting there minding my own business at 4 o'clock and somebody hands you a story for nightly news that you are starting on from square one. Obviously, you're going to depend on the kindness of strangers to get you through to that. There are a lot of people that are going to turn to and help you out. So in that sense, yes, at a network, you do have those advantages. But in the main, the kind of stories that we did, you know, there weren't a lot of people.
You won a number of national Emmys, and I'm wondering, what did that mean to you after all the hard work you put in to receive an Emmy award at the national level?
Oh, it was tremendously, you know, rewarding. It's the recognition of your peers. There's no greater compliment. It was very important. It was very important to us personally. You know, we always spent the money to buy the trophy. When happy to help you out.
Thank you.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
for helping the entire Academy with that. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Very reasonably priced too, I must say. Very important to our bosses too, because oftentimes, you know, we were just too busy to do the entries. And so this was one thing where working for a network helps, because there are people that says, but we're saying, hey, you know, you did the great job. We're going to put this in and we're going to make an Emmy presentation or, you know, try to get you nominated. So, but it was important to us personally and the people we worked with on a story. It was also important to our bosses as well.
I want to head back to Shatar there as well for additional questions from our Pacific Southwest.
Can I just say
chapter.
one other thing?
Yes.
Absolutely.
About Emmys. So when Zoom came along, when the COVID thing hit and everybody was anchoring from home, the thing we used to tease our colleagues about is, okay, we've seen you now with your Emmy in the background.
Yes,
How
yes.
about moving that out now that you've, you know, said how great you are. So that became a thing.
This is true.
Yeah.
And I can't say that I've never done a Zoom interview without them, because
Well, you're proud on the one hand, but on the other hand,
you
it's a
also
little
need to
bit.
find something to put in the background.
Well, true, yes.
But
yes.
I get the notion that it can come off as a little bit of a
Yeah,
humble
especially if
brag,
there's
right?
more than one. You know, Tom Costello, are you listening?
Costello, he won a number of them. Shatar.
Absolutely. Mr. Williams, you've been in some of the top rooms globally. So I want to know, what is next for you now?
Well, one of the things I'm doing is spending time at John Carroll University. As Dan mentioned, it's because of my great reverence for Tim Russert, and there's the Tim Russert School of Communication here, and a lot of wonderful folks at John Carroll who are trying to pass that legacy on to young people today. So that's one thing I'm doing. Another thing I'm doing is, you know, we talked about this before, Dan and I, before starting this podcast or this exchange here, the decline in local journalism, especially for local newspapers, especially in small states like my home state of Wyoming. You know, newspapers are dying, or they're vastly cutting back on their staffs. And so what you've seen in a lot of states is the growth in nonprofits that are trying to supplement it. On the national level, things like ProPublica, which is the organization that broke a lot of those stories
Clarence Thomas story.
about the Supreme Court justices accepting lavish gifts and so forth. But they're all over the country. Mississippi Today is a nonprofit that
Texas Tribune.
Yes, absolutely. Although the Texas Tribune just had some cuts, I see.
Right.
But we have one in Wyoming called WyoFile. I'm on the board of that. So I think that work is important. And then, I'm just sort of catering to one of my interests, which is the great American songbook, American popular song, George Gershwin, Jerome Kern, Richard Rodgers, Irving Berlin. I'm a big fan of that music. I'm working with a jazz pianist in New York, and we're doing a series of what are probably going to be podcasts based on the Great American Songbook. So I spend some time doing that. It's just great fun.
Oh, that's great work. So you're not really slowing down in retirement.
I'm failing retirement miserably.
But as long as you're enjoying yourself,
I am.
And doing great work.
Well, I hope
helping
so.
students here at John Carroll.
I hope so.
This is just wonderful that we have this opportunity today, and we really appreciate it. I wanted to ask you as well about local journalism. We touched on it. You touched on Wyoming, just there being fewer local journalists in a lot of places. And as we look at some information here about local news and whether we are truly doing our job of holding public officials accountable. These are some statistics from Northwestern on their local news initiative showing that TV news is still the most common source of news, local TV, for most people, most news consumers. However, just 30% of the people surveyed here felt that their local news media was doing their job holding public officials accountable. It's kind of the bread and butter of what we're supposed to do, right?
Absolutely.
How do we do a better job at that?
Well, it's tough to do it when staffs get cut back. There were fewer people assigned to cover City Hall or that regularly cover the state legislature or the school board. That's what I started doing in local television, in local radio, where I really started, is covering those city council, school board meetings, county commissioners meetings, making the rounds, talking to the city auditor, all that kind of thing. That's very important work. But as staffs get spread thin, one day you're covering the City Hall beat, and the next day you're supposed to go out and do a story about the pet parade. I mean, it's tough when staffs get cut back. Look, stations have to make the investment in money or in time to allow people to do that. You can't hold public officials accountable if you don't understand what they're doing. As long as they hold the cards and can razzle dazzle you with facts and figures, and you have no way to know whether you're being fed a line or not, it's pretty hard to hold people accountable. You have to have some idea of what you're doing. If you're going to cover the legislature, you have to stay with it. That's just the facts of it. I think reporters have to push to be able to invest the time to do that. I have great sympathy for reporters who don't get the time to do that. It is a problem.
And how has social media changed that, do you think? I mean, as we look at this slide, right below TV news is social media in terms of people's main source for news.
Well,
some of
but
what
they're
they
not
find there may not be reliable.
No, and they're not getting. Look, social media, it's great. People who write on social media don't break news. You're not going to find corruption uncovered by people on social media. There are people who write blogs, and there are people who, like aggregators like Drudge, who just take other stuff and put it together. They're not breaking news. They're not doing the legwork that results in local reporting. Look, this is the big challenge for the likes of you and me and all of you, is the young people. I talk to the students here at John Carroll University. They're not watching local television. They're not listening to radio for the news. They're not reading the old steam-driven newspaper. They get their news from TikTok, and that's pretty scary. It's a real challenge for us to try to go where those young eyeballs are.
And we try to do that, right? Exist in those spaces.
That's
to
right.
Add some
yes,
more filtered,
right.
Contextual news content so that it exists in those spaces.
Yes.
But it doesn't always stand out.
It is the single biggest challenge for those of us in this who do what we do.
Amy, any additional thoughts or questions on all of that from there in Michigan?
Well, I certainly think that's absolutely the case. I mean, we do find all the time that the younger folks that we talk to really aren't watching news the way that older people are, still continue to. I think there will always be a place for local news, for news in general, on broadcast news. I felt like we went through a sort of interesting time during COVID because, prior to that, we had this president who really declared the press as the enemy of the people. And we caught a lot of flack and various events and things like that. And then when COVID happened, suddenly everybody needed their local news again. And it was an interesting dynamic because all of a sudden, we're all in this together. People are in their living rooms, dining rooms, closets, wherever they're broadcasting from.
Right.
And people are tuning in and they want to know and they need to know what's going on. So I thought we enjoyed this very sort of brief sort of news renaissance or local news renaissance there during COVID. So I think that, and I'm not sure that it was necessarily young people watching, but I did feel like it was more people watching. I think that one of the challenges we continue to have too, in general, is just the fact that it's so difficult for a lot of people to know and trust the news that they're getting, whatever it is that they're consuming. And, I would always tell my classes when I was teaching, you've got to think critically. And if something doesn't seem right, you're going to have to go a little deeper. But it is really challenging and somewhat time consuming to be a critical consumer, right? We all have our challenges in getting people to believe the truth. And we're in this very strange space where we can't agree on basic facts. And so I feel like maybe to some extent, young people are turned off by all of that too.
I will say you're absolutely right. It's very disappointing and disheartening. However, I think equally true and equally disturbing is there is a decline in public confidence in almost any institution, in terms of mistrusting corporations, mistrusting government. People don't trust the FBI. They don't trust the courts. They don't trust the cops. I mean, this has been sort of one of the stories of the Trump era, I think, has been the great decline, the great erosion in trust for all kinds of public institutions. It seems like the only ones that still are held in high regard are probably the military. The Supreme Court's own public confidence has dropped off. It's now below 50%. I think it's 41% in the last poll. So, there's it's just a really serious problem that people in America don't trust the institutions set up to serve them. It's including the press.
How do we, in the press, try to rebuild that trust with those we can rebuild it with? There are some people who may not trust the press generally, but how do we rebuild it?
I don't know. I can tell you what it isn't. I've seen these sort of half-hearted steps. Remember, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, the AP suddenly decided that you couldn't just say, a source told us this. You'd have to say a source who spoke on the condition not being named, as though somehow that greater transparency is going to restore public confidence in the media.
But it may have done the opposite.
It may have. It's certainly, I don't think it helped at all. I think that was a completely ludicrous idea. I think a certain amount of transparency is a good thing to, explain how you got that story. The New York Times if you read the print edition when you open it up, there's always a little column about how is it that they did a certain story. I think the certain amount of that is a good thing to, sort of behind the scenes. Well, how did we do this? Why did we do that? Yeah. No harm in that. But look, this is a more fundamental problem. And the president was right about something. He's right that there is fake news. He was wrong about what it was, though. It's not the news media. It's all the junk that you see on social media. There's an enormous amount of misinformation. And the sort of troubling thing about what Walter Lippmann once called the great rancid American public, is people's willingness to believe that. It's a real serious problem.
So I wanted to mention something that the Cleveland Plain Dealer has been doing in recent years. It's something we spoke about in one of our webinars a couple years back. They essentially enacted a strategy to sort of ignore false statements and stunts from politicians. They said that they felt it was working. They said they weren't going to quote absurd claims about the election being stolen. We weren't going to quote false statements. They didn't want to give them oxygen. What do you think about that philosophy? Because there's been I think a bit of a debate in the journalism industry about how to handle things that don't appear to be true. Poynter touched on this recently as well, saying how journalists cover lies is the most important issue in news media right now. Some outlets might even use the word lie or mistruth, while some
they do
sort of dance around it.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I sort of have a couple of thoughts about it. Now, on the one hand, I mean, if somebody has a news conference to make some ludicrous claim that isn't true, don't cover it. However, maybe you do a story later that says these are the three things that Congressman Schwartz has said that aren't true, and here's why. So you do ultimately report it, but you report it perhaps in a different way with a little more perspective, rather than just giving Congressman Schwartz your airwaves to peddle his mistruth. Look, after 9/11, I thought, and I pushed very hard at NBC with only limited success, they would be these recordings from bin Laden that would be recovered and broadcast by Al Jazeera or something. And then we would, American news media would play these excerpts or say what bin Laden was saying. And I said, look, I think when you kill thousands of people, you lose your right of access to the public podium. Why are we giving this guy any further attention? I don't think we should do that. I went to a dinner party where the head of Al Jazeera was in the room. And I said, why do you do this? Why do you give this murderer access to the to the public megaphone?
When no doubt that's what he was hoping for, putting out a tape that it would play.
Well, of course. So why would we
nights.
do that?
Yeah.
I mean, in the same vein, if someone walks into your newsroom and says, I know for a fact that the governor is stealing money from the Treasury, would you just point the camera at him and let them say that on television?
You
Of
need the
course
evidence.
not.
Right.
You would investigate it. So, it's the same thing with things that you know to be outlandish or unsupported. I think you have to treat them, very carefully. And I do think I think the news media a lot has overplayed some of these outlandish statements. The fact that people are making them is a story. How we report them is, I think we overdo it.
This is no doubt going to be just as the last two elections were in different respects. One of the most unusual election cycles we've ever seen. We currently have the Department of Justice investigating both the former president and the current president's son with two different special counsel probes, and a former president who's likely to be running again, who could very well be facing a number of trials within the election year. What are your thoughts about journalism's role in covering all of that in this coming election year, and how complicated all that will be?
Well, let me just add something that's, I think, even more disturbing and troubling, and that is the lack of confidence in the election mechanism in America. Look at all the personal attacks that secretaries of state, which did not used to be a very controversial position,
Or even election workers.
or election poll workers,
Sure,
people
some
on
of that,
elections commissions, people who did the canvassing for voting. We used to think those were just sort of, just good citizenship things. Now you risk your life doing those in some places. Boy, that is a huge concern. People don't have confidence in the way votes are counted. That's just enormously troubling. And so, I'm hoping that some of this stuff, I was greatly encouraged by the lawsuit against Fox News from Dominion Voting Systems. I think when outlandish statements are made like that, people should sue for libel more. And like Alex Jones got sued for, the false conspiracy theory about the Newtown school shootings in Connecticut. So I wish people would do that more. I think it would help.
You talked there about poll workers facing attacks, criticism. Journalists obviously have as well in recent years. I know we alluded to that earlier, but it's something that I know, people in national news face at a somewhat intense level. Programs like Meet the Press and Face the Nation and This Week are scrutinized more than ever before.
They get hammered on social media. Yeah. The day of the January 6th riots, I was on the network live because I was supposed to be discussing how the Electoral Count Act works, how the vote was going to be counted. And suddenly
changed.
everybody is storming into the Capitol. So there I found myself. And we were getting all kinds of questions from viewers saying, why aren't the police arresting these people? If this was a big black crowd, they would be arresting everybody. But this is white guys and they're not getting arrested. Why is that? So what I said on the air is, I said, it's pretty clear why the police aren't making arrests. They're completely overwhelmed. They're being attacked. They're trying to defend themselves. They're in retreat. And then during some break, I went back to my desk and I checked my voicemail messages. And there was some guy who said, you idiot, you liberal moron. The reason the police aren't making arrests is because they're on our side. The cops all support what we're trying to do. And, you're lying and we know where you live and we know your friends and we know that this is your address. And the guy that made that phone call made some similar phone calls. And my call, it turned out not to be part of the case, but he was indicted and he's now in prison.
But these threats are real, and journalists face them too.
Yeah.
You've faced them.
Yeah.
What's your advice maybe for a local journalist who encounters something like that, who hasn't had to deal with that in the past?
Who gets threatened?
Yeah.
Tell the cops. If you work for a company that has Fox, that has corporate security people, tell them. They have contacts in law enforcement. Make a record. Save that voicemail. Save that email. Keep the evidence.
Before we wrap up, I want to get some of your thoughts about Tim Russert's legacy, since we're here at John Carroll University, where he went to school, your great friend of so many years, and how all of us in journalism can channel what he did, his mission and his legacy as a journalist, to be better at our craft.
Well, Tim was, all the things you say about him, I think, are true. I think one of the arts that he brought to what you have to do every week in terms of an interview program, especially, is to try to get people to go beyond their 20-second soundbite rehearsed answer to questions. So what he would do is he would say, all right, Mr. Spieler, this is what you've said about this in the past. Let's put it up on the screen. These are your words.
Great at that.
Then ask a question so they can't just repeat what they just said, to try to get them to say something new and get them off of their normal talking points. So he was very skilled about that. And, we've talked a lot about Tim's sort of ethical standards, but I don't want to leave any mistaken impression. Tim was a very aggressive reporter. And he pushed us to do best and go further and take a story to its logical conclusions and hold people accountable. And we'd say, go get them. And, that's the kind of guy he was. But he was respected by people on both sides of the aisle. He was from that era in Washington, that sort of Tip O'Neill, Ronald Reagan era, where politicians would bash each other all day long and then go have a drink afterwards and celebrate St. Patrick's Day together.
It's a different era now.
Yeah, it's totally different.
He passed way too young, no doubt about it.
Yes.
What would he make of these last 15 years since his death in American politics?
Well, I think number one, he'd be fascinated by it, dispirited about it. I would hope he would have, played some role in holding people to account. I missed him a lot, and I'll tell you one other person that I miss a lot, and that's Gwen Ifill. Gwen was a reporter at the Baltimore Sun and then the Washington Post, and then she came to NBC and covered Congress for a while before ultimately she went to PBS and hosted Washington Week,
where she was also a tremendous debate moderator when she had the opportunity.
Exactly
to
right,
serve
and
in
a
that role.
dear friend, and another person in that Tim Russert mold of someone who was, you know, a difficult and aggressive questioner without being disagreeable. And, you know, I think that's what we so often lack, is people who can ask the hard questions in a decent way that everyone respects them for it. And I guess at the end of the day, that was one of Tim's great strengths.
Some final thoughts before we go about where we are today in modern journalism and what you think your legacy was in your career and what you want to see from journalists here in the future.
Well, I'll leave it to others to say what my legacy is. I don't really feel qualified to say that. I will say that I think, look, we don't know how the young people of tomorrow are going to get their news, whether it's going to be from some implant in their head, or they close their eyelids at night and it's on there, or social media or streaming or
some
what.
webcasts like we're doing now.
Yes,
right.
But whatever form it's in, there is always going to be a need for people who know how to go find things out and then explain it to their fellow citizens and tell stories. And, you know, those skills are always going to be in demand. And I would arguably say we need them now more than ever.
Pete Williams, it's been a real honor.
My pleasure, Dan.
Great to be with you here at John Carroll University today. Our thanks to all of you for watching. Our thanks to Amy and Shatar as well for being a part of this today. Thanks a lot. Good night.